is advised. This is 10-Minute Murder.
David Meirhofer grew up as an outcast. Soon after he was born in 1949, his parents moved their 5 kids to Manhattan, Montana, a tiny town with a population of just over 700. At Manhattan High School, David had a hard time making friends. His peers thought that he was weird because he was quiet and he kept to himself, and he always seemed to be depressed or lost in his thoughts. The year after David graduated from high school, he was drafted into the United States Army. He then completed basic training in California. While he was fighting in the Vietnam War, David started getting the recognition that he had never received as a teenager. His superiors noticed his talent in military strategy and telecommunication, and he received a collection of awards before being honorably discharged 4 years later. After his discharge, David wanted a quiet life. He moved back to Manhattan, Montana, and he set up shop as a carpenter and general handyman. That same year, a 7-year-old girl disappeared from Missouri Headwaters State Park, where her family had been camping. That park was only a 15-minute drive away from Manhattan. 3 days later, Susan Yeager was taken from her family's tent. The FBI in Denver received the phone call. The caller claimed that he had kidnapped Susan and said he would release her in exchange for $25,000. But until the second call came through, investigators thought it was a hoax. On the 2nd of July, the same caller rang the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office. Once again, he claimed to be Susan Yeager's abductor, but this time he doubled down his ransom demand to $50,000. Wanting the deputy who answered the phone to take him seriously, the caller described Susan Yeager in detail, sharing that she had a deformed fingernail on one of her index fingers, a fact that was only known by Susan's family and the police. Now that they knew they were dealing with a legitimate caller, the police arranged for the ransom to be dropped off, hoping that they would be able to apprehend the kidnapper when he came to collect the money. Despite waiting for hours, nobody ever showed up. Hoping that the kidnapper would risk calling Susan's family, the police wiretapped the house, and it paid off in September when the kidnapper called the landline at Susan's house. Her teenage brother Daniel picked up the phone. The caller seemed eager to prove that he was the real deal. He provided details about his previous calls to the FBI so that Daniel would know the call was not a hoax. The FBI traced the call to a gas station in the city of Cheyenne, Wyoming, but it didn't bring them any closer to catching the killer. Then, for months, there was silence. In February 1974, more than 1,000 pieces of human bone were found on an unused ranch in Three Forks, Montana. The bodies had been burned beyond recognition, but the forensic analysis revealed that they belonged to 2 people, a girl of around 7 years old and a woman in her late teens or early 20s. 4 months after the bone fragments were discovered, the Yeager family received another phone call from their daughter's kidnapper. This time, he talked to Susan's mother, Marietta, for almost an hour. Once again, he proved that he was legitimate by referencing previous conversations with the FBI. But shortly before he hung up, he informed Marietta that he would not be able to give her daughter back. The FBI discovered that the call had been made using several communications devices built into the telephone cables of an innocent man living in Three Forks. Although this didn't show the identity of the caller, it revealed that he was more intelligent than they'd previously thought. This was a highly sophisticated, meticulous man with an expertise in telecommunications, who was determined not to be caught. The FBI created a profile of the person they believed was responsible for the crime. The profile described a white male in his late 20s who had grown up in the area. They believed he would have spent his life as an introverted outcast, and at some point, he either had worked in telecommunications or the military, possibly both. There was one man who fit this profile exactly, David Meirhofer. The more that the investigation zeroed in on David, the more evidence suggested that he was the killer. He had been in Wyoming on the day that Susan Yeager's family received a phone call from their daughter's kidnapper, and he had also worked several jobs at the ranch where the 2 sets of burnt human remains had been discovered. In August 1974, David Meirhofer was arrested. He initially claimed that he was innocent, and investigators were forced to release him. But when Susan's parents listened to the recordings of David's voice, they were convinced that that was the man that had called them. When Susan's family received another threatening call from their daughter's killer in September 1974, the FBI positively identified the caller as David Meirhofer, and he was arrested for a second time. As soon as he was in jail, they carried out a search of his house, and in his refrigerator, they found several severed fingers, as well as an entire human hand. Now, David was backed into a corner. He felt as if he had no choice but to confess, telling investigators that he had fatally stabbed Susan shortly after her abduction because he could not get her to stop struggling. Even if the ransom had been paid immediately, Susan's family never had the chance to see their daughter again. She had died the same day she was taken. David never revealed his motive for the kidnapping. He repeatedly denied that he sexually assaulted her, but he made no efforts to provide investigators with another theory. As well as confirming that he'd kidnapped and murdered Susan, David confessed to carrying out a similar crime in February of 1973. That victim was 19-year-old Sandra Dykman, who had disappeared while watching a basketball game. David revealed that he had been sexually interested in Sandra, but she rejected him. Infuriated, he kidnapped her, tied her up, and gagged her to prevent her from escaping. But he was too aggressive with Sandra's bindings, and she ended up suffocating to death. Once his victims were dead, David had disposed of their bodies in the same way. He used a saw and his hunting knife to dismember them before he burned them, then dumped the bones and ashes in the abandoned ranch where they were later found. Investigators working on the case suspected that Sandra and Susan weren't David's only victims. He'd abducted both girls easily, been confident enough to contact the police, and he had a clear, thought-out process for disposing of the bodies. The theory that David was a more prolific killer was confirmed before the trial, when his defense attorney proposed a plea deal. In exchange for avoiding execution, David would confess to 2 more murders. The additional victims were 12 and 13 years old and had both been killed in the nearby city of Three Forks. 12-year-old Michael E. Rainey had been fatally beaten in May of 1968, and 13-year-old Bernard Pullman had been shot to death in 1967. Bernard's death had initially been thought of as a tragic accident, as the police thought he'd been hit by a stray bullet from somebody hunting nearby. David had still been a teenager when he'd killed the boys, and once again, he did not admit to a motive for the murders. The only clue he gave was admitting that, before murdering Michael Rainey, he had thought to himself that he, quote, wanted to get a little kid. Still, the investigators were suspicious that David had only confessed to murders that had taken place in Gallatin County, Montana. They believed that the 4 crimes were only the tip of the iceberg, but they would never find out the true extent of David's crimes. The jailers who were responsible for David Meirhofer had never been informed that he was arrested for murder, so in a massive oversight, he was never regarded as a suicide threat. Only a few hours after confessing to Michael and Bernard's murders, David used a towel to hang himself to death in his jail cell. More than a decade after David's suicide, his little brother Alan was convicted for raping several children in Washington. He spent almost 20 years behind bars, surrounded by rumors that there was a connection between David's murders and Alan's crimes. Alan refused to give any statements about his brother, creating yet another mystery about the motives of the men in the Meirhofer family. That's 10 Minute Murder for today. Brief and bingeable true crime. I'm Joe, the host, and thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to listen to this podcast today. But if you've got more to go, if you're on a binge right now, don't let me stop you. Keep on moving to the next one. If you are brand new to listening to 10 Minute Murder, welcome. Put your feet up, make yourself comfortable, subscribe wherever you're listening to this right now, and you can more easily catch up on all the back episodes. And just a side note, if you're listening on YouTube right now, YouTube does not have all of the episodes. So if you find a podcast listening app that you enjoy using, use that and you're going to get all of the episode. There are more than 350 something. There's a bunch. So there are a lot for you to catch up on. Connect with me on social media. See the pictures of what we talk about here. Never gross, never graphic stuff though. And usually about this time is where I will read an email from one of you that listens, asking me a question about anything under the sun. Today I'm going to read an email, but it's not a question. And I'm only reading it here because it made my day and I want to say a public thank you. So here it is. This is from Andrew in Chattanooga. Joe, greetings from Chattanooga. First of all, I just want to say thank you. I got into your podcast toward the beginning of this year and became quickly hooked. I listened all year whilst walking on the treadmill, driving, doing yard work, doing real work, and most other activities in life that I could get away with listening, and finally made it all the way through last week. It has definitely become my wife and I's favorite. The format, your sense of humor that somehow weaves in nicely with darker subjects, and the artful way you put the stories together in a larger context of mental health. Just brilliant. I hope you continue to put out great content in whatever format you choose for the future, and I will be there to listen always. So I just wanted to really express my gratitude, first and foremost. Second, I thought I'd throw a case your way that is relatively close to home for me that I thought you might be interested in doing for the podcast one day. And then he goes into tell me about this really, really interesting story that I'm not going to spoil now. I'm going to do more research on that, but I'll get back to you. But Andrew in Chattanooga, thank you. I read this the other day and it absolutely made my day. Now, obviously, we all like to hear nice things about themselves, but when it's something that I put so much time and effort and money into, like this podcast, to be appreciated for that, it makes it feel worthwhile. And by the way, I've mentioned before that I live in the South. I don't live in Chattanooga, but I live close enough to drive. And I go to Chattanooga pretty often. I say pretty often, but not super often. I go to visit the otters at the aquarium there. And Chattanooga is one of my favorite cities in the South. But anyway, Andrew, thank you so much for the email. And thank you and your wife for listening to all of the episodes. And you'll find in the near future that I'm striving to put out more content than I have previously. Like this past week, there were 3 episodes instead of 2. I can't do that every single week, but I'm going to try to do it more and more often. But anyway, that's it. That's your episode for today. Thank you so much for listening to 10 Minute Murder.